I don't know about anybody else, but these last 2 years have been quite the whirlwind. And for me, that's not only because of like the big pandemic thing. So it was 2 years ago last month that I given a talk at the UK festival, where really we were talking about what was still to come. It was just pre-launch of Vendr, so we were talking about what we'd been working on, all the implementation details. So that was a pretty scary. But since then, we've done kind of quite a heck of a lot. Had over 50 releases of both the core product and a number of add-on packages and payment providers and things. So that's including lots of bug fixes, additional features such as dashboards and analytics and printing, exporting. So we've just been really busy with those releases. We've solved over 300 plus issues on our issue tracker. So again, we're just really trying to stay on top of those and keep progress. We've also answered over 300 forum posts, which is kind of cheating because I'm top of the Karma leaderboard now because of all of this. But yeah, we just again try and stay on top of that. We try and get answers within like 24 hours when we tested all of that. So pretty happy and pleased about that. We won an award, so we won the best expansion, which yeah, again just really chuffed that. And actually like how it's doing what it does. We launched a partner program, so we've got a number of partners, and it's just a really good way of getting agencies and individuals to be able to showcase just how well you know and understand Vendr. So if you want to find out more about that, you can find me or Lucy and have a chat about how you can get on there as well. And we weren't enough with just releasing one version, we've released another version as well. So V2 of Vendr is now available, and this is our Umbraco V9. Jump to swap.
Just speak to board.
Oh, directly. So this is V2. This is running on V9, and yeah, currently we can actually say that we're the only integrated e-commerce platform that runs on Umbraco V9. So that's pretty cool. Thank you. And we've also built and released, along with a couple of other, with U Marketing Suite and HQ, the Swag Store. Actually, no, we've not released that, so just pretend you've not seen that one at all. But yeah, we've been doing some great work there, which will hopefully launch pretty soon. But it's not just us as well, so there's some great community stuff going on, some fantastic blog posts, getting started and using Vendr, videos on YouTube. Shout out to Paul Seal, who did an amazing intro video series on how to get started with Vendr, which we loved so much we actually made part of the official documentation. So again, thanks Paul for that. We need a V2 version now though, if you've got free time. But yeah, and just plenty of other contributions as well. So people actually creating payment providers and releasing those open source, producing add-ons such as Vendr reviews. So again, even though we're a commercial product, it's just really cool to see that the Umbraco community is still doing that open source thing and getting involved from that respect as well. And of course, we're seeing people launching sites. So we've already over 100 sites launched using Vendr, ranging from kind of space beers to dash cams and wine and cakes. So yeah, there's just a whole load of people releasing sites, and again, we're so pleased that people are actually using the product and getting stuff out there. And anytime you do release something, do let us know, because we just love to see everything that's launching on Vendr. But with all of that progress and success, we do still get kind of like the same questions every now and again. And by far, probably the biggest one is how many products does Vendr actually handle? Or if we're talking to people that have implemented a solution and not used Vendr, they'll usually say, we wanted to try Vendr, but we just weren't sure how well Vendr would scale. And our answer to this has always been along the lines of, well, Vendr handles as many products as Umbraco can nodes, which everybody knows the answer to that, right? Well, No, surprisingly, people don't, and neither did we, to be honest with you. So, guess that was our cop-out answer, that we knew it could handle a lot, but we just didn't know really how many it could. And so we thought we'd use the presentation then to, why don't we just find out? So that's what we're going to have a look at today, just Vendr in a few ways, and see how it performs. So, hi, I'm Matt Brailsford. I run a company called Outfield Digital, and that's where we developed the Vendr product. So hopefully I'm pretty decent from a coding perspective, but what I'm not that skilled in is performance testing. And so when it came to doing this presentation, we decided to reach out to somebody that we knew their thing about performance, but equally knew their thing about Umbraco, and also definitely knows their thing about Vendr, and that is our own Umbraco Digital. So they're one of our first, actually the first prestige partner that joined the Vendr Partner Program. And yeah, we've worked closely on projects that they've been working on, so we just knew that they knew their thing about Vendr and Umbraco, and we know that they know their thing about performance. So all of the stats and everything that you see today we couldn't have done without the help of Umbraco Digital, so thanks to the guys up front. So the problem, really, I think when people how many and those types of things, really just asking what are the potential bottlenecks that could occur at scale when using Vendr, and what is available to kind of work around those. And with Vendr, this really boils down to two areas, and this is products and orders. So what are the any performance issues around either of these two areas? So this is what we're going to kind of base our measurements on. From a products perspective, we're really wanting to look at the number of products or Umbraco nodes that we can actually handle, and then also the number of product variants. So I'll explain variants, what we mean by variants in a moment, but yeah, those particular areas I think are the key things from a product perspective. From an orders perspective, I think we're looking at how many concurrent orders can we actually process and put through a system at any one time, and then whether we see any potential back office issues with having quite a lot of orders in the system. So these are the primary areas that we're going to take a look at with these benchmark tests. So before we get into any of the tests, I think there's just a couple of key concepts that are worth knowing and understanding. So the first is the product variants. So I'm sure when you've been on e-commerce sites before, you've seen this type of thing where there's a product and ultimately there's a series of attributes or options for that product. So this is what we mean by product variants. There is the product and there's a number of variants. The thing you're buying is a combination of these things. So in this example, this cup is available in different volume sizes and in different colors. So the variants of that primary product. In Vendr, there's two ways of doing variants. So the first is node-based variants, and as you might imagine, the way that we do this is we'll have a primary product, and the variants are defined as individual nodes beneath that product. This gives you the full power of Umbraco and doc types and things like that. But the downside potentially to node variants is it's a bigger management overhead. So you have to manage all of these individual kind of combinations, which if you've got a lot of attribute-based combinations, then that's a big, a potentially larger thing to manage. So because of that, we tend to see that people use node-based variants more for kind of single-level variants. And then from a multi-level variant perspective, we actually recently launched a multivariance editor. And this is actually based on the block editor within Umbraco. So the multivariance editor is much nicer UI and interface to managing multiple variants at any one time. So it tries to take a lot of the headache of generating all of those product variant combinations for you, and you just need to fill in the details. So it's a little bit less to manage. The only thing to know about the editor, because it is a property editor, is all that variant data currently stored as JSON data in a property on a product node. So we'll get to see in a moment how that affects things from a performance perspective, and also why we've chosen to go this route and what we can do with that at a later stage. The other key concept to understand is a thing called product adapters in Vendr. And product adapters are vendors. Well, it's an interface within Vendr that tells Vendr how to convert one thing into a product that Vendr knows how to deal with. And out of the box, the thing is an Umbraco node. So we take data from an Umbraco node, product adapter, and this is how Vendr then extracts all its information that it needs to do for things like price calculations and adding things to a shopping cart. And the big thing about product adapters is it's swappable. So you can out the default implementation and use data from something other than Umbraco, which again we'll look at why that's a nice thing to be able to do in a moment. So the plan, we are going to perform a series of benchmark tests, but the first thing that we're going to need to do or have is some kind of solution that we're going to run those benchmarks on. Now this ultimately no e-commerce solution is the same as any other solution. So how do you benchmark something in a realistic way that's meaningful for everybody? And I think the answer is really you can't. So the best that we can try and do is come up with some kind of average solution. And so what we came up with was this setup. So we based it on Azure, which makes it a lot easier to do automated tests and run these performance tasks on. And we decided to base it on an Azure S1 app service instance, Azure S2 SQL database instance, which is Umbraco's minimum requirement suggestion for running Umbraco on Azure. On top of that, we're using Umbraco v9, and from a vendor perspective, we're using new v2. We're using the Vendr demo store, which is a generic kind of based e-commerce setup, and the Vendr checkout plugin, which is our drop-in solution for doing checkout with minimal setup and implementation. So none of those are particularly honed. These are just like general average kind of implementation that somebody might implement. So we'll see how this type of site can handle things. So from a test process perspective, what we're going to do is we're going to write some interaction scripts. So these are JavaScript scripts that define common interactions or the process of accessing the website. Then we used a tool called Codecabin to do the load test. So it's going to run those scripts at scale against our baseline solution. And then we ran some metrics to track and measure what actually is going on beneath the hood. So the first thing we want to take a look at then is the product side of things. So here we're going to run through a few test cases. So the test cases that we set up, we defined 100 products, product nodes, and then for each one of those, we defined a range from 10 to 5,000 variants. So we did that both for variant nodes and the multivariance editor. So at the maximum test case, we're really testing like 500,000 products, which hopefully is a significantly large number. So the measurements, what are we going to track? So we're going to look at the product variant lookup times, and that lookup time is the time it takes to convert a product node into a vendor product snapshot, which is like that key point between Umbraco and Vendr. We're also going to look at the back office usability, see if there's any issues that come along with having this many products. And we'll also look at the system resource usage. So the results, product variant lookup times. So what we saw, here you can see we've got two lines, one for content-based variants, and then we've got the multivariance editor below. So when we've got 100 products with 10 variants on content nodes, it was taking about 8.5 milliseconds to look up variants. So that's an average of about 0.85 milliseconds per variant defined in the system. And when you go to 100 variants, which is 100 products times 100 variants, we're at 84 milliseconds. which is still averaging about 0.84 milliseconds per variant. When we go to the multivariance editor, though, we see there is more of a significant kind of bump. So we're at the lower end, we're at 10.5 milliseconds, but going up to 237 at the 100 by 100 variants. Really, the big significant, or the big reason for this, the difference between those is the fact that multivariance editor is based on a property editor, and it's all JSON data stored within a single property. So the overhead there is ultimately that whenever you're looking up a variant that's in the variance editor, it's got to find the product, load that JSON into memory, and actually process that, deserialize that, and then find that product. So there is an overhead that comes with that, and obviously the more products that you define, that's going to get potentially bigger. Now, we kind of knew this was going to be a potential issue when we developed this approach, but the reason why we went down the block list editor route is because we knew that Umbraco are planning the move to block list editors potentially being nodes themselves. So if Umbraco do that, because we have built on top of the block list editor, then we can start to take advantage of that. Because the results, we can see that Umbraco have actually done a pretty decent job of keeping things performant when you're just looking up nodes directly from Nucache. So there's some things that we need to bear in mind right now, but hopefully we can take advantage of Umbraco's progress in the future with that. So in summary with the variants, we were really, from a variant node perspective, we were seeing pretty consistently that it's about 0.85 milliseconds per variant in terms of lookup times. For the multivariants, it's kind of an exponential penalty. So the more variants that you're actually defining, the worse that performance is going to get. But I mean, it was still within the couple of 100 milliseconds, even up to like a 1,000 product variants on 100 nodes. So there's still some leeway there. From an actual performance in terms of the conversion versus variant content conversion, you're at around 25 variants defined in the multivariance editor before it's more performant to use the content variants instead. Now, you can still use the multivariants, I think, up to about before it's kind of significantly different enough. But yeah, right now it's about 25 variants before you need think of product nodes instead, which I think is pretty decent in most scenarios as well anyway. So from a back office usability perspective, you might imagine if we think from the Umbraco content based products, if we use the list view for managing and displaying all of that, Umbraco have actually done a really good job of making that pretty performant. So we weren't really seeing any issues there. There's a lot of the list is limited, so you only see a certain amount of product nodes, and it's paginated at the server side. And so even with quite a lot of products in there, it was really handling that pretty well. So I don't think there was any issues there with however many products we threw at it. The only downside to the list view is that it's not that optimal from a searching perspective. So if you are looking for the products, it can be a little bit slow with the search. It is possible to intercept that and implement like custom searching logic to make that a little bit better. But yeah, it's not the best. It's usable though. That's, I think, and there's possible ways of improving that. So from the multivariance editor perspective, because it's a property editor, at the moment it does everything client side. So when it's listing all of the variants, we basically render every variant in that list. So we don't do any pagination on that or anything right now. So yeah, when you're listing this many, it does start to get a little bit sluggish in the browser, taking a little bit of time to render those things. Around about 500 variants, it started to become sluggish, and at the very extreme with the 5,000 variants, it started crashing out Chrome. But I think there's definitely stuff that we can do there. So even if that's implementing like client-side pagination, just to limit how much actually needs to render, because it's that rendering that was the thing that was really causing it to run slower because it's just got so much data that it's got to try and render in one screen. But again, hopefully with Umbraco releasing, when Umbraco actually do the thing of blocks list items being nodes, then we get that server-side pagination back, and hopefully we can get that performance gain in Vendr as well. So from a system resource usage perspective, we didn't see that much from a CPU and network side of things. It really all came down to memory usage. So on the left here, we've got the baseline solution with basically nothing in it. It's just an empty solution, and that was sat at around 50% memory on the S1 instance with nothing in it. And then these are a little bit backwards compared to the other data that we're showing, but here on this side we've got the 100 times 5,000 variant nodes, so this is 500,000 nodes in the system, and this is sitting about 68% of memory. And when we look at the 100 times 5,000 multi, you can see this is going pretty high, up to like 80%. So we can see that Umbraco is actually a lot better at managing a lot of smaller nodes in new cache than it is holding like a smaller number of nodes but with a lot of data on them. So again, hopefully we can deal with this when block lists start to do node-based systems, but we need to just be careful. And I mean, to be fair, I really think this is an unrealistic one. We're really pushing it to the limit to what these things do. But if somebody's got 5,000 variants, I think that's really quite a lot of variants anyway. Even on like with 100 products, 5,000 variants, that's a lot. But yeah, so the other thing that you'll probably need to bear in mind with these things is cold boot times, and this is the time from starting application. The main thing that slows Umbraco down is building those leucine indexes and the memory footprint. On an empty solution with nothing in there, we were seeing it was taking about just over a minute and a half to build up leucine, and when we were dealing with the 500,000 product nodes, it was taking like way up to almost 16.5 minutes, which is significant when depending on when you're actually doing the scaling. So from a scaling perspective, it just means you need to bear this in mind, because you don't want that to happen at a point when you've got traffic on your website. You need to plan ahead if you need to scale up at any time to handle those volumes. On here, you can see that with the 100 times 5,000 multivariants, though, it only took 2 minutes, which kind of makes sense because really all it's got to index is 100 product nodes, and then all of the variants have just been stuffed into a single field. But this isn't really that searchable, so you might have to implement something to split that up into individual fields, and then you've got more that's going to go on in your indexing, so that might creep up as well. So from a system resource usage perspective, CPU work really didn't see that much of an issue. It's really going to be about the memory usage that you're going to need to kind of keep an eye on at the extremes. For the Azure S1 instance, about 500,000 products is manageable, and it depends how you split those up, to be fair. Like I say, I think the thing of multivariants, having 5,000 variants, is unrealistic, but we got to that level and it was still performant, and there was just enough headroom left to be able to do like other aspects of work within Umbraco. The biggest thing really is, from a scaling perspective, is you're going to need to be scaling upwards rather than out. So creating multiple instances of the site is not really going to be that helpful, because each one of those needs their own memory footprint of everything on the site, and they're pretty much going to get maxed out straight away. So you're going to need to start scaling up rather than out, which is a little bit harder to automate. And again, with the cold boot times, you need to bear those in mind to make sure that you're planning ahead of potential load that's going to happen on your site. And factoring those cold boot times into that as well. So there is one escape hatch that Vendr has, and this is that product adapter thing. So with the product adapter, what you can do if you have a lot of product data and it is starting to become a problem in Umbraco, then you can actually offload all of that product data into some external system. So maybe something like StructPim. You can put that into a dedicated data storage solution that is able to handle that amount of volume, and then you can write a custom product adapter that can extract that information and tell Vendr this is how you extract that information from data from that system. You'd also have to implement something to be able to display that on the front end, but yeah, it's just another tool in your toolbox if you start to get to those extremes, that you can actually swap that out and move the data to an entirely custom data storage mechanism. So from the orders, the test cases that we're going to take a look at, we're going to see, we're going to run a ramping test. So we're going to throw 50 users through the checkout flow, gradually adding more users as we go along. And from a back office performance perspective, we're going to try, we're going to fill the database with 100 up to 500,000 orders and see what that does to the back office performance of Vendr. So the measurements that we're going to take a look at the order volumes, how many orders can we put through in a certain amount of time. We're going to look at the back office usability to see if there's any slowness to the UI with that many orders, and we're going to see about resource usage as well. The results. So order volumes. So what we did here was run a load test on the site. We threw around 6,500 requests at it in an 8-minute period. We were seeing that this was going peaking at around 20 requests per second, and from the reports that we got from that, we could see that it was getting to around 30 users at 20 requests per second, keeping everything below a 1 second mark, but after that it started to back up a little bit. We were seeing a few things that were hanging in a CPU thread. When we were looking into that, there's potentially a few quick wins that we can take a look at. So we were seeing some kind of hanging SQL statements that we can try and optimize those. They're not necessarily hanging for a long period of time, but when you're under volume, it all adds up, and that's potentially where those things were slowing things down a little bit. And we also saw a potential issue with some asynchronous code that we're having to run currently in a synchronous way. So this is what we think is happening, is some thread starvation. So it's waiting on threads to become available, which if we ran this actually synchronously, we wouldn't potentially have those. So there's definitely some improvements that we've identified, and then we can try and optimize to get those wait times down. But from an order volumes perspective, as I say, keeping things under 1 second, we would reach about 30 users sessions, concurrent sessions at around 20 requests per session per second total. In that 8-minute window, we managed to push through 550 orders, which was averaging about 1.2 orders per second, which is pretty decent, I think. And the good news as well is that there was direct correlation with increased resource. So if we increased the CPU by twice as much, we were actually able to put twice as much throughput through as well. So yeah, we increased everything 2 times by doubling the resources. And yeah, we identified that there's definitely some improvements that we can make, but even with those things that we're seeing, I think the results are pretty decent at a baseline, especially given like the baseline project that we're working with on minimum resources. From a back office usability perspective, there's a few areas in Vendr that we could have had a look at. One of those is like the settings area, but the reality is that this is kind of a set it and forget it region, and that you don't actually define that many resources here. So it really wasn't, there was nothing really significant in this area that was worth looking at. It was really all around the order management. You want to see how many orders you can list, how many orders you can search through, and what happens when you've got more, when you put more orders into the system. So we had a look at timings for rendering the list of orders based on how many orders that we had in the database at any one time. And we also had a look at the timings for performing an actual search. So from a listing perspective, when we only had 100 orders in, we were at 400 milliseconds to show a 30 order list. Up to 100,000 orders, we were getting to just below a second to be able to render that. From a searching perspective, the lower end, it's a bit quicker because you're not returning as many results that match your search term. So it was about 120 milliseconds. But at the higher end, it did start to slow down at just over a second. But there's definitely some optimizations and quick wins we can implement there that we found. So one, for the listing side of things, is by default we list everything in reverse date order, but we don't actually have any indexes on those date fields. So a really quick win is for us to drop an index on those fields, and yeah, it dropped our kind of times in half. So with 100,000 orders in second before, and it's only 600 milliseconds now, and up to 500,000 orders defined, it was 3.5 seconds and just 1 second with the index on there. But that is pretty promising for us because we knew there's other optimizations that we can really put onto that database and be some immediate quick wins. But again, this is the extreme end potentially of having tons of orders. So hopefully we've got a lot of leeway in terms of getting to that point and dropping those fixes in. From a searching perspective, the way that we currently do our searching is to generate a SQL statement with like queries in there, and we were seeing that those were running with 100,000 orders in the database. It was taking about 500 milliseconds to perform one of the search terms. But one way we could really optimize that is by implementing full text search, which when we added that ability, even with 500,000 orders in the database, we were getting like extremely quick results at 15 milliseconds. So that is definitely something that we could take a look at to improve that. The only downside to full text search from a SQL Server perspective is that it's an explicit install step. It's on by default in Azure. And the other thing, we currently still support SQL CE for Umbraco 8, which is for demo purposes, but we still do support CE, which doesn't support full text search at all. So if we are to implement that, it will probably need to be some kind of feature flag or feature detection. But again, it's another thing that we can definitely look at to add more to add another improvement to that. So from general settings, really didn't show anything of significance that we thought we needed to worry about. Order management performance is really still pretty fair with like hundreds of thousand orders in the system. So it's after a while that these things are really going to affect anybody, I think. And there's absolutely further improvements that we've identified that we can implement and really improve some of those SQL queries pretty straight away as well, I think. So from system usage, searching in the back office and the settings areas really don't have a lot of effect. It's really going to be under load the number of orders. So if you've got a really busy site is where it's really going to impact you. And as I said, we identified that some things were starting to hang up a little bit with more and more requests thrown at it. And so this is the CPU at that time, which did go up to like 80%, which is ideal, but at the same time maxed out either. And like I said, there's a direct correlation that could increase the resources, and it's pretty consistent that it kind of increased resource would be a bigger benefit. So again, planning ahead, if you know you're going to get a lot of traffic, you can pretty easily increase your resource and know that it will handle it fine. It shouldn't be a problem. So yeah, from an order processing perspective, CPU is going to be your defining factor right now. On the Azure S1 instance that we were trying, we were seeing about 30 users sessions and around 20 requests per second being where it started to hang up a little bit more than I would hope, more than you would want to. But you were still reaching about 1.2 orders per second during that time. Again, the those resources mean you're going to have to scale up rather than outwards. So the same rules apply there about planning and trying to do it preemptively. And just from a scaling perspective, on Azure, we saw much more performance benefit from a P1 V2 instance plan versus moving to the S2 plan as the next step, which are comparable from a cost perspective. So if you are getting to the point where you need to scale, we saw better performance out of the P1 V2 versus the S2. As per the other, there's definitely some SQL and async improvements that I think we could take a look at and improvements on and really streamline that a little bit more as well. So just in summary, from a products perspective, out of the box, Vendr really should handle like over 100,000 products with pretty well. But from a multivariance editor perspective, at the moment, that's probably limited to around 100 variants per product, which I think is adequate to a lot of solutions, but there's again, once the node-backed block list editor stuff comes along, I think we'll see some significant improvements there. Memory usage will be your main concern from a product's perspective. So the more products you have, it's going to fill that memory in the new cache and Umbraco's internal memory. Still some quick wins that we can do from a performance perspective there. But if all else fails, or if it's proving too much having all that product data in Umbraco, then you can move it all to an external system and the product adapter to make that available to Vendr. From an orders perspective, Vendr should really, we saw that an S1 instance was able to handle around 30 concurrent users at 20 requests per second total. CPU time is your biggest resource usage that we're seeing there. There's still some improvements out of the box that we can improve the performance. But ultimately, the thing about all of this is the developer's worst answer, which is it depends. What I've presented here is the baseline solution. It's our general demo store, which is not that optimally implemented. It's a demo of what it can do. The checkout plugin is our drop-in solution that's like trying to do a lot of the legwork in the simplest way possible, but it's not necessarily the best way. So we've got a multi for that checkout. But if you did a single checkout flow, you're skipping out like 6 page requests. So you can really improve the throughput just by moving to a single page checkout process rather than a multi-step. So it does really depend. But I do hope that at the very minimum you can see that even on an average solution with basic resources, Vendr can handle a lot, and there's we've also learned a lot from this process, and there's definitely some things that we can implement and improve. But we'll keep doing that, and I hope that we'll see more people Vendr and hope that it can handle what people want from it. So thank you very much. If you want to find out more about Vendr, you can do so at vendr.net. You can tweet us at HeyVendr or me personally at Matt Brailsford. But that was benchmarking Vendr, and thank you for listening.